All right, let me ask you something. How many dashboards does your HR team have right now? If I had to guess, you probably have several. In my experience, whenever I worked with CEOs and I asked them about their HR function, they had one major complaint: dashboards. The problem was not that HR didn't have data, it was data rich, but it was insight poor. And this is one of the most expensive gaps that I see in modern CHROs. They don't really understand what to do with the data. And that's an expensive problem, and it's one that's going to make their roles obsolete. Welcome to the channel. I am Trent Cotton, the human capitalist. I've noticed that there is a big difference between HR business practices and how business actually gets done. I've spent over 20 years in HR helping the C-suite rebuild their organization while the world around them shifted. I've designed this channel to be an intelligence briefing on the business of people. So, if you're a CEO, board member, or a CHRO looking for the signal in the noise, welcome to the channel. Now, let's get to work. In the first episode, we talked about the architect, who is the CHRO who understands the organization as a system. And then we got into the engineer, which goes one step below and starts understanding how all those systems are connected and where the breakdowns are. And in this episode, I want to talk about the third persona, which is the scientist. And I want to make something very clear before we get started. I am not saying that you need a data analyst on your team or a data scientist. And I'm not saying that you need the new sexy software out there for people analytics. This is something completely different. It's a mindset. It's a way of approaching problems that I want to dig into. This is about a fundamental shift of CHROs just showing up and reporting the data into actually using the data to, one, identify the right problem, and two, provide a diagnosis for it. All right, so real quick story. Whenever I got into my career, I thought I was going to be a banker. So I love numbers. I trust data. It always tells a story. But whenever I decided to make the pivot and get into HR, I found that HR was very data rich, but insight poor. Now, before getting into HR, I used data to help clients, very wealthy, very business oriented clients. And I served as an advisor, turning that data into a story and turning it into a forecast for their personal wealth and for their business wealth. And honestly, whenever I got into HR, I thought this is going to be a superpower, but it wasn't. I found out something completely different. So if you think about it, HR does sit on a lot of data. We have data in the HRS, we have an ATS, we've got engagement platforms, performance tools, exit survey data, pulse surveys, all of this data. So what I find is whenever a CEO asks a question like, why are we losing our best people in the first 18 months? Most CHROs come back with a turnover rate. That's not an answer. That's a number. And the CEO, they already know the turnover rate. That's why they're asking you the question. What they need to know is, why is it happening? Where is it coming from? And what specifically needs to change? And unfortunately, most HR functions, even the well-staffed ones and the well-resourced ones, they cannot answer the question with evidence. And that's what I mean by being data rich, but insight poor. And believe it or not, it is costing your organization in ways that don't show up cleanly on any of your dashboards. Now, let me be fair. I'm not going to be too hard on HR. It's not entirely HR's fault. The tools have outpaced the capability. Most CHROs, they were trained to collect and report, and very few were trained to hypothesize, test, and interpret. Those are completely different skills. And the business is now demanding that CHROs and HR to function as scientists, using data to identify the problems before they happen. And look, this is just not one of my gut feelings or just based off of my experience. There's actually numbers to back this up. Deloitte's Global Human Capital Trends report found that while 71% of companies see people analytics as a very high priority, only 9% believe that they have strong analytic capability. 71 say it matters, 9% can actually do it. And then Gartner found out that only 22% of HR leaders say that their analytic insights are having a significant business impact. So even the organizations that are running analytics, most of what they're producing isn't moving the needle on the actual business decisions. But here's the kicker. McKinsey published research that shows that companies with mature people analytic capabilities, they are 3.1 times more likely to outperform their industry peers on total shareholder return. That's 3 times better. So the upside of getting this right is enormous. And yet the majority of organizations still lack, and they're kind of stuck in presenting correlation instead of causation. Now, here's what I mean by that. Just as an example, correlation is our engagement scores went down in Q3. Now, causation goes a little bit deeper. It says, all right, The decline in engagement in Q3 was concentrated on teams who were managed by first time managers who had fewer than 2 check ins per month with their direct reports. And those same teams showed a 40% higher voluntary turnover rate in the following 90 days. Now, if you compare the two statements, one gives you something to act on, the other one just tells you something that happened. And the scientist persona or mindset in a CHRO, it's all about moving from the first statement, which is here's the number, to the second, which is here's the number, here's what caused it, and here's what I think we should do for it. So, what does the scientist mindset or persona actually look like in practice? Well, let's start with the real version of a scientist. And no, I'm not talking about the one in the lab coat or anything in a chemistry lab. I'm talking about the scientific method. A scientist doesn't start with a conclusion, they start with a question. And then they form a hypothesis, and then they design a test. I cannot tell you how many times in my experience people in HR hated me because my favorite quote is by William Deming: "In God we trust, everyone else must bring data." And what I found HR doing is they would have a gut feeling and then go find data to support it rather than actually starting with the right step, which is identify the problem and create a hypothesis and then go research. And what makes this so critical is that scientist mindset in a CHRO. It can apply that type of a thought process across the organization for every people problem. And it is so incredibly important now as we start looking at how do we integrate AI with the workforce that someone with a scientific method background and an obsession that they're the ones that are actually leading the people function. So rather than going, all right, this is the end all be all tool, this is the AI thing that we need to use, they're actually going in and saying, okay, what problem do we need to solve? Is this a people? Is this a process? Or is this a technology solution? And they run tests and they make the final decision based on that test. I think what we're seeing in the market now is that there is a lot of shoot, fire, ready, aim. A lot of companies are looking and saying, okay, AI is the new sexy thing. Let's go after it. And they're making people decisions to retrofit the data and the norms and everything that's going on in the media, and I think that is a cliff that we're heading toward. So I want to share an example from my experience. I was brought into an enterprise level company and they were growing incredibly fast, but they were losing some of their key top individual contributors. And whenever you looked at it, it was kind of the classic high performer attrition, the kind that's incredibly expensive and almost always preventable. So the HR team previously, they looked at the data and they ran exit surveys. They had performance reviews and engagement scores. But every time the CEO asked what was driving this attrition, the answer was the same version of compensation is too low or lack of career growth. And those are the two things people say in exit surveys when they don't really want to answer what actually went wrong. So I was the fun person. I got to go back and say, we need to look at the data differently. We pulled the manager assignment history, very key step. We looked at the correlation between manager tenure and the direct report attrition. And then we cross referenced promotion rates and skip level feedback scores. And what we found is that 73% of the high performer attrition was concentrated under 6 managers out of a total of 80 in the company. And when we dug in to see what those 6 managers had in common, it wasn't malice. They weren't evil people. It wasn't even incompetence. It was a very specific set of behaviors around recognition and workload distribution that had never been addressed because no one had ever connected that behavior to the outcome. What happened in that example is that the data pointed to the root of the problem and not just the symptom. And more importantly, we knew exactly where to start. All right, now let me break down the 4 capabilities that I look for whenever I'm evaluating whether CHRO is actually operating as a scientist. So the first one is hypothesis driven thinking. Before that scientist mindset kicks in, before they pull in a single report, they start with a question and a hypothesis. Not here's the data that we have, but we believe that first year attrition is being driven by onboarding manager behavior. Let's test that. Or if they're thinking of a new initiative, they use one of my favorite questions from design thinking, which is how might we X? That framing changes everything about the approach to data. And this also helps you fall in love with the problem and not trying to find the easiest and quickest solution. All right, the next behavior is causal chain mapping. This is the ability to trace a symptom back to the root cause, not stopping at Engagement is low, but asking what's driving it, where is it concentrated, what behavior is producing it, and what is the cost to the business? The scientist builds that chain all the way from the outcome because that's what the business cares about. And then the next behavior I look for is evidence based recommendation. This is where a lot of CHROs and HR people in general, they just miss it. They get the data, they find the pattern, and then they present the insight, but they stop short of the recommendation. The scientist doesn't stop there. They come in with here's what we found, here's what it's costing us, and here's a very specific intervention that we recommend, and here's the projected outcome. This is what we want to test. Now, when you go into the C suite with that type of a mindset and that type of a strategy, that's going to get their attention. All right. So if this is something that you're like, wow, I kind of need to develop this type of a mindset, here's how you can get started. First, pick one current people problem and build a hypothesis. Don't start with the data, start with a question. We believe that X behavior or condition is driving Y outcome. Write it down before you look at anything else. That single step changes how you engage with the data and it forces intellectual honesty right from the start. Next, map the causal chain all the way to the business outcome. Take whatever people issue that you're currently working on, like retention or performance, whatever it is, and don't stop until you can connect it directly to a metric that the CFO, the CEO, or any of your other C suite that they actually care about. If you can't draw that line, then the insight is not finished yet. Next, I want you to change the format of your next leadership presentation. Instead of leading with the data, lead with a question, then the hypothesis, then the evidence, and then the recommendation with the projected outcome. That structure is how scientists present their findings, and it is dramatically more persuasive than any kind of slide deck full of cool little charts. All right, so let's bring it home. The CHRO who just reports the data is becoming a very expensive librarian, and they're going to become obsolete. The business can get most of the metrics from a dashboard. I mean, hell, they can even get it from AI. Now, the CHRO who begins to operate as a scientist, the one who builds the causal chains, tests these hypotheses against workforce data, that is someone that the CEO cannot afford to lose. And the gap between those two versions of the role is not about intelligence. It's not about access to tools. It's about the approach. It's about the mindset and being willing to ask the harder questions and follow the evidence wherever it leads. In the next episode, I want to get into the fourth persona, which is the COO. This is a cross functional type of integrator operator who handles things at a strategic level. The CHRO who doesn't just understand HR, but can step into conversations about revenue, operations, growth, and actually add value. That's who we're going to talk about in the next episode. I'm Trent Cotton. Remember to invest in yourself because no one's going to do it quite like you do.